Okay. So here's what I want to talk about. So the Buddhists argue that it is primarily ignorance about our identity that is responsible for suffering. And this ignorance consists in two kinds of things. One, in having a false belief about a metaphysical self. There's a soul, substance, or something like the Hindus talk. And the other thing we are ignorant about is this: we seem to have this ordinary sense of self as being unified across time. I am the same person who agreed to do this talk a few months ago. So that, ordinary sense, which is often called ahankar, is also in question. So the Buddhist wants you to get rid of both of these. And so the Buddhist project of deconstructing one's identity requires us to get rid of a false belief in the metaphysical self as well as the ordinary sense of self. And according to the tradition, the advanced Buddhist practitioners and bodhisattvas seem to have relinquished their sense of self. That's what the tradition says. They've given up the notion of ahankar completely. Here comes along Christine Kosgard. It says, if this is the right description of the Buddhist project, like I've just described it, which aims at this deconstructing a sense of self, according to her, that project would be incoherent. Now, of course, she doesn't have the Buddhist in mind. She's talking to Parfit. She says, even if we accept with Parfit that there is no answer, there is no determinate answer to the question, what am I? In terms of acting for practical purposes, we need an answer to the question, who am I? We need to construct an identity for ourselves. We need to have a sense, we might have a sense of being a philosopher, being a mother, being a wife, whatever. But these various notions is what we use to construct our sense of self. And she thinks this is necessary because, I'm going to the middle of the slide now. It is necessary to think of oneself as having, a continuing identity over time in order to carry out, in order to be an agent, to carry out, or even make a plan of life. So suppose a Buddhist has a plan of life. They make a plan of life to become a Buddhist monk. According to Christine Kosgard, you need to identify with that um, with that project. You need to say, that's what I want to be. I am going to be such and such. And that's why she thinks, this sense of giving up one's identity, deconstructing one's self is going to be an incoherent project. And so I want to say that bodhisattvas are moral agents and they're morally admirable. They have a morally admirable plan of life, which is to work successfully, which is to work selflessly to eliminate or at least reduce suffering, right? Everyone thinks that's a morally admirable plan of life. And they don't have a sense of self. That's what the tradition says. So, how can we argue for the soundness of the Buddhist project? This is the question I want to address here. Against Coast Guard, I want to say the Buddhist project is totally sound, and let me show you why. So, here's a preliminary response to the question. Someone might say that, in the early stages of the practice, you can have a sense of self. So, Buddhist novices and monastics in the early stages can think, I am a continuing person. I have a plan of life. I want to be a Buddhist monk. And they can behave as if they have a sense of self. It's only, you might say that it's only the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas, who have relinquished their sense of self, but that's an idealization. It need not be actual. I don't think that gives us a theoretically satisfactory response to the puzzle or to the question, because we would have to say, if this is right, we would have to say that the advanced practitioners, stream enterers as they are called, um, and the enlightened Buddhas who have given up the false belief in the sense of self, or the false sense of self, they are going to be in a constant state of self-deception. And I think that is just wrong, because to make sense on the Buddhist path requires not just right actions. You don't just do the right things, but you have to do them with the right understanding and the right knowledge. So you can't be in ignorance about your own identity. This, I think, would be against the spirit of Buddhism. It is a mistake to think that advanced practitioners who have given up the belief in the sense of self are self-deceived. That is to say, that they unknowingly harbor a self-conception while actively pursuing the project of getting rid of their self-conception. So I think if we accept this preliminary response, we cannot characterize properly what it is to make sense, make progress on the Buddhist path, and we cannot make sense of the Buddhist account of enlightenment. And to accept that Buddhas are bodhisattvas and not agents, let alone moral agents, is just not in the spirit of Buddhism. So here's the plan for the rest of the talk. I know there are 5 sections, but they're very short sections. Just quickly talk about, the contemporary challenge, which comes from Coast Guard, and Schechtman gives you a way of spelling it out. Then I go for a Buddhist inspired reasons for resisting such a construction, some Buddhist responses to this question. So, people in the Buddhist literatures, for example, Garfield and Graham Priest, as well as Charles Goodman, have addressed, have a kind of response to Coast Guard. And I show why their responses don't work before I give you what I think is a theoretically satisfactory response. And it will be for you to judge what you think of it. So here's Coast Guard's reasons for why we need to construct an identity. Firstly, she says there is just the raw necessity of eliminating conflict amongst your motives. So let's suppose that you think of yourself primarily as a student. I used to like to use that example. Or you think of yourself, primarily as someone who's a party person. You have in the evening, you need to decide, what do you need to do? Should I work on my essay, or should I go out and party? If you think of yourself primarily as a student, if you identify as a student, then, because you have one body to act, you will make up your mind that you can only stay home and do your essay. Second, Coast Guard says that most of our actions and projects take time, and they will very likely, carry you sometime in the future. When we are thinking about actions, you must your present self must identify with something from which you will derive your reasons, but not necessarily something which is present. When a person is viewed as an agent, she thinks you need to have a continuing identity, because no content can be given to just a present self. So we're not just talking about a present self, we're talking about an identity. So let's say the student identity is going to give me reasons to do various things over a period of time. And from that, I will derive my reasons. The third thing she says is that our relationships to our actions and our lives is essentially authorial and first person. What this means is whatever identity I give to myself, and if I want to change that identity because of various reasons, I have to make that decision. I change myself. It is not something that should be forced on me. So, she has this conception of we are autonomous beings, and we make our own decisions and we construct our own identities. She doesn't, Coast Guard doesn't give you a proposal for constructing an identity, but something that fits very nicely with her proposal, and it has been suggested, is Shetman's proposal of having a narrative identity. So how do we make an identity for ourselves, or how do we construct persons, as Shetman puts it? We constitute ourselves as persons by forming a narrative self-conception. We can't construct biological persons, but we construct a narrative self-conception, which gives us an identity about this is what we are. And that narrative self-conception we can use to experience and organize our lives. This self-conception, might be largely implicit and automatic. We don't, have to think about it all the time. But to have a narrative self-conception is something that gives, that it gives significance to our present experiences and actions. You make sense of your present experiences and actions in the light of, the narrative that you have about yourself, which puts, your experience past and anticipated future into perspective. So Maria Schechtman, she argues, we literally constitute ourselves by forming a narrative self-conception. On her view, persons in this sense, our self-conceptions are, we create them. We are self-creating. So, but she does recognize that, this kind of agency that is essential to personhood requires an ability to interact effectively with the social and natural world that we find it. So we just have a narrative self-conception. We're not, as I said, self-creating ourselves as biologically embodied entities out of nowhere. That's not what we do. We find ourselves, so to say, in the world, and then we create a kind of identity for ourselves, which makes us autonomous agents and gives us reason to do what we do. So she does say that, in order to have this kind of identity, we need to individuate ourselves. In our world, we need to depend on the social and natural world. In our world, we individuate and re-identify people at the most basic level by individuating and re-identifying human animals. So we take that for granted. Our practices are built around this when it comes to having bank accounts, passports, baptisms, university degrees, and crimes committed. What is in one's human history is part of who one is. You can't deny that. But over and above that, history, you can create an identity for ourselves. The fact that our practices are built this way is not a mere convention or accident of history. It is rooted, she says, in our form of embodiment and presumably runs deep in our evolutionary history. Oh, why is this not going to the next slide? Okay, so now we go to the Buddhist reasons for reconstruction, for construction of persons. So first, I think, the strategy used by Schechtman suggests that we have to presuppose a notion of persons ourselves, the embodied persons, the natural and the social facts. Second, and the Buddhists would want to question that. Second, this way of thinking about persons assumes a certain metaphysics of properties and kinds, roles and conceptions in terms of persons, and I think the Buddhist wants to question that. And third, this also assumes our ordinary interpersonal practices. So she says things about, baptisms, having passports, and about, retribution for crimes that are committed. The Buddhists might also want to question those kinds of practices. Those are not practices that everyone, we don't find ourselves in that embedded in that practice. So regarding the first point, having a narrative self-conception, already presupposes a person's. It cannot stand alone. And this point was made by Baker, Lynn Rudder Baker in 2014. So this is what she says: there must be a person in order to have a personality, or there must be a person in order to have an identity, to create it. There must be someone to create a self-narrative. Who? surely persons create narratives. If one must be a person in order to produce a self narrative, then it is incoherent to suppose that being a person depends on already having produced such a self narrative. So Baker is pointing to the circularity here. The Buddhist reason, I think, for rejecting this kind of thing is, taking you back to what the Buddha says in the Samyutta Nikaya, which is what is impermanent, what is suffering, and what is of a nature of a change, is that suitable to regard as I. So here, what the Buddha is talking about is, should we identify with the skandhas, the mental and physical aggregates? Um, and the question is no. We should not say, this is mine, I am this, I am a student, or I am a philosopher, or this is myself, because that's only going to lead to suffering, and um, it's only going to lead to suffering anytime we identify with something. So all the aggregates should be looked upon as, this is not mine, I'm not this, this is not myself. So according to the Buddhists, I think the problem is when I say I identify with, any subset of states, being a student, being a philosopher, being a mother, anything, that already suggests that I am something apart from these X, Y, and Z. I'm identifying this with this. And the mistake, according to the Buddhists, is not that we identify with the wrong sort of thing. The mistake is that we identify it all. Having any kind of identity, with which is going to give you reasons for acting, is also going to bring suffering. The more you identify, the more attached you get. The second point is the, priority of our ordinary metaphysics. As I said, this kind of idea of identifying with certain roles or conceptions, being a student or being a philosopher, that's sort of taking on a kind of, thinking of the priority of roles or conception. So it's probably, I was quite surprised to see that the term person in its first meaning is, a mask or a persona, a role that someone is playing on stage. Um, that's how the term person comes into the English language. It is a recognition of the fact that everyone is always and everywhere, more or less consciously playing a social role. I've inserted the social. It is in these roles that we know each other, and it is in these roles that we know ourselves. We know ourselves not as individuals, but, having all these roles that are playing, we are playing. That seems to be the human condition. And I think the Buddhists must resist such a proposed construction, because the project assumes the priority of roles or conceptions of properties rather than particulars. Buddhist metaphysics, rejects properties and kinds as carving up nature at its joints. The only thing that really exists are particulars. The third thing to say, just briefly, for rejecting such a conception, is there in this way of thinking, in the Western way of thinking, we are giving too much prior, sort of, we give priority to our ordinary practices. So there is kind of, we have to punish people for crimes that are committed. This descriptive metaphysics, gives priority to ordinary moral and social practices. And I think that part of the Buddhist metaphysics is partly motivated by a need for major consideration of our ordinary personal related concerns and interpersonal attitudes. I mean, think about one difference. Buddhists say anger in all its forms is unjustified. Whereas in contemporary literature, we think, that there is this whole literature going about, why we have to think some kind of anger against um, social injustice or something like that is justified. And so the Buddhist is not going to take, yes, this is how we respond, this is how we normally respond to social injustice, but we have to stop and think whether this is the right way to respond to this. Buddhist is thinking about, changing our practices. They don't say we should have pride, or because pride is, again, it is the way we respond when someone uh, gives you praise, but is that the right way to respond? The Buddhist thinks no, because pride is bound up with the self-conception. Anyway, so I think that the Buddhist way of thinking requires us to rethink agency and moral responsibility. And this is the larger project which is behind thinking about this. Anyway, let me come back to what other philosophers have to say about how we might respond to Course Guard. So this is the first quote on the screen is from Goodman, Charles Goodman, in his um, 2009 book, says the alternative to the practical standpoint that Coast Guard is talking about is the enlightened state, in which there are no decisions. You don't need to make any decisions about what to do once you're an enlightened bodhisattva. In that state, there is theoretical cognition, or perhaps non-conceptual intuitive insight, which clearly sees how things are. Innate great compassion, uniting with this insight, spontaneously produces bodily and vocal movements that cause happiness and relieve suffering of others. So Goodman, kind of goes whole heartedly and says, we can reject the whole Coast Guard thing. We don't, a bodhisattva at that stage of practice does not need to be deliberating about what I need to do. They can just see clearly, what is to be done, and they need to. So Buddhas and bodhisattvas are not, conscious agents deliberating about what to do. And this is the second quote is from Garfield and Priest in a recent paper. We think instead, they say, that while Buddhas are agents and are conscious, their agency and consciousness is non-dual, non-conceptual, and spontaneous. That is absolutely skillful. They're not making deliberate decisions. In the literature, there is also this slogan, I think, that that Finnegan and Tanaka, Brahman Finnegan and Koji Tanaka started in a paper, that the Buddha just has to not think, just act. Sure, this is a way of responding to the Coast Guard thing, but I think that's just going too far, because consider how in the stories, in the Buddhist literature, the Bodhisattva's actions are described. So this is again the Bodhisattva Vimalkirti, and his in Goodman has a quote about how the Bodhisattva acts. So Bodhisattva Vimalkirti is engaged in all sorts of businesses, yet has had no interest in profit or possessions. To train living beings, he would appear at crossroads and on street corners, and to protect them, he participated in government. To develop children, he visited all the schools. To demonstrate the evils of desire, he even entered brothels. To establish drunkards in correct mindfulness, he entered all the cabarets. Now, if that's the description of Vimalkirti, if that's the description, it seems to me that he would have to be a deliberating, choice-making agent. This does not fit with the standard response. Someone who's participating in government really has to think about what policies to adopt. Someone who's going to visit schools to give advice to children, has to think about what to say. So I think, we have to leave some room for, we have to leave some room for decision making, because that's how a bodhisattva seems to be described in the tradition. And those of you who are familiar, these stories abound in the tradition about what the Buddha said and why did he say it and so on. It's not acting without understanding. I don't think, the slogan we talked about, don't think, just act, works. So what I want to suggest, and we're what I want to suggest as a response to this question is to think about that the debate about between Buddhists and Coast Guard concerns this traditional dichotomy that there is deliberate intentional action and there is spontaneous automatic behavior. But recently, I might hurry this up, recently empirically informed philosophical work on skilled action, so I want to say the Buddha is absolutely skillful, is challenging these traditional dichotomies. So people are not now talking about having spontaneous intentional action, having intelligent reflexes, not just automatic reflexes. This is Crocker in John Hopkins, who's a scientist, a neuroscientist. He talks about, how experts can do intelligent reflexes. So most actions, the thought is that most actions are a combination of purposeful, goal-directed, intentional behavior that relies on deliberation and practice-induced automatized responses. So these things are working together. The normal examples that are given as tennis and driving, think about Djokovic, the famous tennis player. He's not just acting spontaneously. There is a lot of deliberation going on in his goal-directed behavior when he performs so well. And this is not just of, motor behavior, which is tennis and driving, but also true, Crocker thinks, in terms of poetry and mathematics. And this is one of his quotes: Serena Williams is no more just a bundle of habits than Jane Goodall is. It's not just habitual responses that make us skilled. Skilled action depends on a continued interaction between cognitive, so deliberate, and automatic control processes. And that's why recently cognitive scientists have been talking about a mesh, cognitive architecture. Let me explain this very quickly. So learning a skill, a motor skill or any kind of skill, requires this, what the scientists call a 3R framework. It involves reasoning, so you understand action outcome relationship, and on the basis of that, you construct some control policies or strategies. Then you refine those properties by continuous action, continuous practice, and that you can think of, training in the monastery, which takes, becoming a bodhisattva takes various lifetimes. You are honing in your skills. And sometimes in the process of refinement, it requires iterative implicit adjustment to a control policy. You might have to go back and change the control policy because of the practice. And the third thing to say is, retrieval at any stage. There's reason and there is refinement, and an expert can quickly retrieve these policies. And becoming an expert requires, this kind of hierarchical mesh, which involves all these three things together. There is high strategic control, so there is reasoning and high strategic control. There is situation control, and there is also automatic control. And these work together. So cognitive and automatic processes characteristically operate together in an intimately meshed agreement, with cognitive control typically focused on strategic task features. So, the thought here is that experts have to perform in complex, difficult conditions, and the interpretive and regulative functions of cognitive control gain increasing importance as difficulty increases. So you can think of Djokovic, who's acting who's playing on the court, he has to continuously rethink what he's doing and how to, sort of overcome the opponent. And sometimes has to rethink the strategies because you never know what kind of opponent the world might throw up. And so also for the expert bodhisattva, they're not just acting mindlessly. There might be, novel moral situations where they have to think what they have to do, how they should respond appropriately. And so they've not given up deliberation, but they're always, conscious, deliberating agents. And I won't go on for too long since we're running out of time. We started a bit late, but the training of the Buddha requires, all of these things over a period of time, um, so that the Bodhisattva or the Buddha um, becomes capable of responding appropriately. I just want to say that the cultivation of perfections on the Buddhist path, what it does, what it aims to do is transforms one into an expert moral agent and progressively into a Buddha. This is done with understanding of what one is doing and why one is doing it. And even enlightened Buddhas may sometimes they may act without deliberation, but they have reflective capacities at hand and can reactivate them as one is needed. And none of this requires a self-conception. This being able to act deliberately does not require identifying with being a student, or identifying with being a moral agent. I don't think the self-conception does any work in in the way. I just want to conclude with a quote from another bodhisattva that the Buddha is praising. So this is Subhuti in the Diamond Sutra. The world honored one, when the Buddha declares that I excel amongst holy men, I do not say within myself, I am a holy one of perfective enlightenment, free from passions. World honored one, if I said that within myself, such am I, you would not declare. Subhuti finds happiness abiding in peace, in seclusion, in midst of the forest. This is because Subhuti abides nowhere. And what I want to add, this is because from the first person perspective, Subhuti is not free from passions. Subhuti is not holy. Subhuti is not enlightened. He's not identifying with any of these things. Subhuti does not identify with anything. He's just has these qualities. He's free from passions. Others might describe it, but he does not need a self-conception. In fact, he correctly recognizes that he's no one. Thank you.